declarou a pandemia, nós já começamos a organizar o acampamento Terra Livre online e saímos na frente, sendo o primeiro movimento social a organizar uma grande mobilização online. Então, o nosso acampamento de 2020 teve mais de 3 milhões de acessos durante toda a nossa programação. E durante todo o ano, nós seguimos com uma série de articulações, né, da parte jurídica, da parte da comunicação, né, da nossa assessoria política, para evitar a retirada de direitos, né, sobretudo no Congresso Nacional. Articulamos elaboração de leis, né, de projeto de leis, juntamente com a deputada Joênia Apitiana, lá na Câmara dos Deputados. Conseguimos aprovar, né, um projeto de lei na Câmara e no Senado, mas, ao chegar no Executivo, né, foi vetado 16 dos 23 itens que constavam naquele projeto de lei. E o primeiro ponto a ser vetado foi o acesso à água potável para os povos indígenas. Isso demonstra o grau de irresponsabilidade e de falta de compromisso, né, desse governo para com os povos indígenas. E também foi a primeira vez que o Supremo Tribunal Federal acatou uma ação, né, impetrada pelo movimento indígena, pela APIB, e determinou ali a elaboração de um plano de enfrentamento à pandemia, né, pela União. E assim seguimos, né, com a Assembleia das Mulheres Indígenas, com a Assembleia Cura da Terra, que aconteceu de forma, aliás, em caráter também internacional. Bom, e nós estamos agora, em 2021, em junho, realizamos um mês de acampamento em Brasília, com o Levante pela Terra. Fizemos ali uma grande luta contra a aprovação do projeto de lei 490, que é esse projeto de lei que vem assustando, né, nós, povos indígenas, porque traz ali, né, junto mais 13 projetos de lei, né, que estavam já organizados ali, tramitando lá no Congresso, lá na Câmara dos Deputados. Então, trouxe o 490, traz junto a PEC 215, né, traz junto o próprio infanticídio, traz junto a liberação para garimpo, para mineração, para desmatamento, né, para o agronegócio, além de transferir essa responsabilidade, né, essa atribuição de demarcação dos territórios indígenas do Poder Executivo para o Congresso Nacional. A gente já fez essa luta lá atrás, contra a PEC 215, né? Ela foi perdendo força, não conseguiu ser aprovada, e agora volta com muita força no 490. Assim como tentam ainda retirar o usufruto exclusivo dos territórios indígenas, né, pelos povos. Então, é um projeto de lei altamente nocivo. Foi aprovado agora, né, em junho, na Comissão de Constituição e Justiça, e está lá pronto para ir para a Câmara, para o plenário da Câmara, a qualquer momento. E, além de que, né, o projeto de lei 2633, que é o projeto de lei da grilagem, que autoriza invasões e premia os invasores, que já foi votado no plenário da Câmara, né, e agora já está a caminho do Senado. Tem ainda o projeto de lei 191, que é o da mineração, que tentam também já aprovar ainda nesse mês de agosto, né? Bom, e aí nós voltamos agora, né? Vamos voltar agora na próxima semana a Brasília com o acampamento Luta pela Vida. Esse acampamento que vai, né, acompanhar o julgamento do caso da terra indígena Xoclém, lá no Supremo Tribunal Federal, né? E o resultado desse julgamento é o que vai orientar o futuro das demarcações de terra indígena no país. Então, é um dos julgamentos assim, mais importantes da história, e, por isso, nós marcamos o acampamento de Luta pela Vida para esse período, para que a gente possa estar lá sensibilizando os ministros do Supremo Tribunal Federal a votar favorável aos povos indígenas. Bom, e logo em seguida do acampamento Luta pela Vida, nós vamos chegar em Brasília com a segunda marcha das mulheres indígenas, né? Essa marcha que traz como tema mulheres originárias reflorestando mentes para a cura da terra. E são com esses dois eventos, né, que acontece logo agora no final de agosto, e as mulheres no começo de setembro, que convoco também aqui para a grande mobilização dos estudantes indígenas, que vai acontecer no mês de outubro. Então, está sendo muito importante para nós o fortalecimento de toda essa rede internacional que se solidariza, né, e que tem manifestado apoios ao movimento indígena, né, aos povos indígenas no Brasil. Então, termino chamando essa mobilização internacional, né, para que possa estar também se organizando e articulando as mobilizações para os dias 24, né, dia 25, agora de agosto, onde nós vamos estar fazendo a vigília lá no Supremo Tribunal Federal e mais alguns outros atos, né, no Congresso e também lá no Palácio do Planalto, em Brasília. Então, é muito importante que vocês possam estar se manifestando também com atos, né, com vídeos, com falas, com apoio financeiro, a nossa vaquinha, que já está no ar, né? Temos o link aí. Então, é muito importante que essa rede internacional demonstre cada vez mais esse apoio das mais diversas formas, seja nas redes sociais, seja com a contribuição financeira, seja com o apoio político, né, com essas manifestações, e ajude-nos a pressionar, né, o governo brasileiro para que respeite os direitos dos povos indígenas, para que não retire, né, tão pouco que a gente conquistou até agora. Então, essa pressão internacional é muito importante, muito valiosa para a gente, né? Já está mais do que dito que a luta dos povos indígenas é uma luta pelo futuro da humanidade. Já está comprovado que o futuro é ancestral. E o chamado de agora, né, o chamado urgente que a Mãe Terra nos convoca é a proteção das nossas florestas e a reconexão com a nossa ancestralidade, para, assim, juntos, a gente curar a terra e salvar a humanidade. Então, eu agradeço muito aqui a todos os organizadores, organizadora desse evento, e deixo aqui esse chamado para as nossas próximas mobilizações. Estamos juntos, muito obrigada. Essa luta é nossa.
Muito obrigada, Sônia. Vamos passar a palavra para Eloy, então. Estamos prontos?
Olá a todos.
Desculpa, Eloy, vou te apresentar rapidinho. Eloy Terena, of the Terena people of Mato Grosso do Sul, is an attorney, a researcher, an Indigenous land rights activist, and the legal coordinator of the Articulação of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil, APIB. He holds a postdoctoral fellowship from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and a PhD in social anthropology from the National Museum of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Eloy is a leading legal expert on the history of the movement for Indigenous rights in Brazil. In 2020, he was the second Indigenous lawyer to argue successfully before the Supreme Court, the first being Congresswoman Joênia Wapichana, and the first to win a constitutional jurisdiction suit. Earlier this month, on August 9th, he led a team of Indigenous lawyers and experts in helping APIB file a complaint to the International Criminal Court, the ICC, denouncing the government of Jair Bolsonaro for genocide. Muito obrigada, Eloy, por estar aqui com a gente. Vou passar a palavra para você agora.
Olá a todos, boa noite. Em nome da Articulação dos Povos Indígenas do Brasil, APIB, eu gostaria de saudar todos os participantes e também agradecer pelo convite e pela realização desse webinário, tendo em vista que um dos momentos mais cruciais para os povos indígenas no Brasil se aproxima, que é a próxima semana, em que o Supremo Tribunal Federal irá analisar um importante caso Choclen, e irá definir o regime jurídico das terras indígenas no Brasil. Nós costumamos dizer que o Supremo, na verdade, irá decidir o futuro dos povos indígenas no Brasil. Isto porque os direitos dos povos indígenas estão, de fato, protegidos na Constituição Federal de 1988. Nós temos, na Constituição brasileira, um artigo que assegurou o direito originário dos povos indígenas aos seus territórios tradicionais. Então, são essas as palavras que a Constituição escolheu para outorgar esse direito. No entanto, nós temos observado que, nesses últimos 30 anos, está ocorrendo no Brasil um processo de desconstrução dos nossos direitos. Alguns chamam isso de um processo de desconstitucionalização, né? Porque se lá atrás houve todo um trabalho do movimento indígena, das lideranças indígenas, para constitucionalizar, para consagrar esses direitos na Constituição, nós temos visto isso nos últimos 30 anos, na verdade, um movimento de desconstrução. E um dos principais aspectos que afetam os nossos direitos, sem dúvida, é o que nós chamamos de marco temporal. É uma tese jurídica, também conhecida como teoria do fato indígena, e alguns ministros e alguns magistrados do Brasil estavam aplicando essa teoria, que é uma tese restritiva, né? Por que ela é uma tese restritiva? Porque ela reconhecia apenas o direito dos povos indígenas às terras que eles estivessem ocupando na data de 5 de outubro de 1988, que é a data da promulgação da Constituição brasileira, deixando de fora e ignorando, na verdade, a realidade de muitos povos indígenas que foram expulsos de suas terras, que foram removidos forçadamente, inclusive com o aparato do Estado, e que essas comunidades estariam, então, perdendo os seus direitos. Essa tese do marco temporal, é importante dizer que ela não nasceu necessariamente no judiciário. A gente, fazendo as pesquisas, encontramos já no início dos anos 90, políticos ligados ao governo executivo defendendo a necessidade de se colocar um marco aos direitos dos povos indígenas, tendo em vista que a Constituição tinha reconhecido os direitos originários, e essas pessoas começaram a espalhar fake news já naquela época, dizendo que os índios iriam querer todo o Brasil, dizendo que os indígenas iriam querer Copacabana, por exemplo. Isso é uma falácia, isso é uma fake news, porque a Constituição não diz isso. Esse discurso foi também para o Congresso Nacional, e já nos anos 2000, nós encontramos discursos de parlamentares ligados ao agronegócio defendendo a aplicação desse marco temporal e a necessidade de se colocar um marco aos direitos dos indígenas no Brasil. Em 2009, quando o Supremo começou a analisar um importante caso também, chamado Raposa Serra do Sol, que é justamente esse caso em que a deputada indígena Joênia Wapichana atuou, houve toda uma articulação política de o Supremo trazer novamente essa tese do marco temporal. Então, nós vemos que essa teoria jurídica, ela passou por todos os poderes, né? Começou pelo Executivo, pelo Legislativo, e foi no Judiciário que ela ganhou força por conta do perfil conservador e racista que nós temos no Brasil, em boa parte dos membros do Poder Judiciário que desconhecem a realidade dos povos indígenas. E de lá para cá, muitas outras manobras foram sendo construídas em torno do marco temporal. Em 2017, foi baixado um parecer vinculante da Advocacia Geral da União, tornando obrigatório a observância do marco temporal por parte da FUNAI e de toda a administração pública federal brasileira. Esse parecer, também chamado Parecer 001 da Advocacia Geral da União, ele atualmente está suspenso por força de decisão do Supremo, por conta de um pedido feito pelas comunidades indígenas junto com a APIB. Um outro aspecto é que, em 2017, quando o Supremo analisou um outro caso do povo da terra indígena, reserva indígena Xingu, no Mato Grosso, o Supremo analisou a demarcação da terra indígena e, embora naquele momento o Supremo Tribunal Federal não tenha analisado o marco temporal, os ministros votaram e deram um claro recado ao governo e aos ruralistas de que essa tese é uma tese que não iria prosperar. Isso foi em agosto de 2017. E de lá para cá, os ruralistas começaram novamente a fazer a sua articulação no parlamento. Quando eles viram que o judiciário sinalizou que essa é uma tese que não iria passar, eles voltaram a fazer as articulações no parlamento e começaram a movimentar um outro PL, que já foi citado aqui pela Sonia Guajajara, que é o PL 490, o projeto de lei 490. Esse projeto de lei 490, ele é de 2007 também, e ele tenta institucionalizar o marco temporal pela via legislativa, né? Então, é uma lei que traz aí a tese do marco temporal, e nós vimos que, recentemente, quando o ministro do Supremo colocou esse caso, Raposa Serra do Sol, ou esse caso Choclen, para a votação, mais uma vez, os deputados ruralistas tentam acelerar a aprovação desse projeto de lei, tentando mandar um recado ao Supremo Tribunal Federal de que a opção do parlamento é pelo marco temporal, ou tentando, inclusive, forçar o Supremo Tribunal Federal a acatar essa tese jurídica. Então, isso tudo está relacionado. O marco temporal, ele é sinônimo de garimpo em terra indígena, ele é sinônimo de desmatamento, ele é sinônimo de arrendamento em terra indígena, e ele abre, inclusive, a possibilidade de você questionar terras indígenas que já foram demarcadas no passado. Cito aqui o exemplo claro de uma terra, de um processo que nós atuamos, que é o da terra indígena Caiabi, no Mato Grosso, que é habitada pelos Caiabi, Apiacá e Munduruku, uma terra homologada, inquestionavelmente indígena, mas que teve a sua homologação suspensa por aplicação do marco temporal. Então, o marco temporal representa, para nós, povos indígenas, a declaração de extermínio, porque ele inviabiliza a demarcação das terras indígenas e também abre a possibilidade de se questionar terras já demarcadas. E é importante frisar que no Brasil nós temos o registro de 114 grupos isolados. E, inclusive, esses povos indígenas que vivem de forma isolada estão em terras ainda não demarcadas. Então, eles estariam completamente sem nenhuma proteção. Então, a APIB chamou esse acampamento na próxima semana, porque, sem dúvida, depois de 1988, que foi a promulgação da nossa Constituição, este, com certeza, é um dos momentos mais cruciais para os povos indígenas, porque a Suprema Corte Brasileira irá definir, por meio desse julgamento, o futuro dos povos indígenas e das terras indígenas brasileiras. Por isso que nós estamos fazendo esse esforço de levar essa mensagem a todo mundo, né? E pedir também que todos se solidarizem conosco, juntem-se conosco nessa luta, porque essa luta não é somente nós, dos povos indígenas, por todos os aspectos que a Sônia já trouxe, o papel fundamental que os territórios e nós, com o nosso próprio modo de vida, desempenhamos no equilíbrio da humanidade. Então, com essas rápidas palavras, que eu gostaria de trazer esse cenário um pouco histórico para quem não acompanhou como é que surge essa tese do marco temporal, e nós estaremos lá no Supremo Tribunal Federal defendendo o direito originário dos povos indígenas e pedindo que o Supremo Tribunal Federal declare essa tese do marco temporal como inconstitucional, reconhecendo assim o direito originário dos povos indígenas aos seus territórios tradicionais. Muito obrigado.
Thank you so much, Eloy. Muito obrigada por sua fala. Vamos agora passar a palavra para Leo Crippa. Está me ouvindo? Okay. Leonardo Crippa is a descendant of the Coya people from Northwest Argentina and a senior attorney at the Indian Law Resource Center. He received his law degree from the Universidad Nacional de Tucumán and an LLM from American University. For almost 20 years, Mr. Crippa has practiced law in the field of human rights and advocated for the enhancement of policies and procedures to safeguard Indigenous peoples from the environmental and social harm caused by the projects funded from multilateral development banks. He helped develop the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples adopted by the General Assembly of the Organization of American States in 2016, and has represented Indigenous communities and other human rights victims before both the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in Washington and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in San Jose. Thank you so much for being here, Leo. It's a pleasure to present your work. I'm going to give the mic to you.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this panel on this very important topic. I'm also thankful for the chance to be able to work alongside with attorney Eloy Terena and Sonia Guajajara. I am going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint with photos that will explain a little bit the applicable international law and policy standards that uphold the rights of indigenous peoples in Brazil to their lands, something that the court should consider whenever a case relating to the Marco Temporal thesis is at stake. So let me see if I can do this. If I can share the screen. Oh, apparently I'm not authorized to do this.
Can you try again, please?
Now it is working. Let me see. Okay, let's get started. So I was asked to provide some views on some legal and policy standards that can help make decisions on this very important topic, and also to provide some background information about some similar characteristics that indigenous peoples from North, Central, and South America share. So this is a list of important characteristics that you can find in, for example, in the Navajo Nation here in the US, in Maya people in Central America, or with the Yanomami in Brazil. There is a clear collective attachment to the land. There are cultural, economic, social, and political institutions that make indigenous peoples different from national society. And there are also different languages that differ from those that the national society speak. They also face some threats. what you were able to see here in the US with the North Dakota pipeline is the same that you can see in Brazil with hydroelectric projects, with deforestation happening because of logging, with all the threats coming out of agribusiness and cattle on indigenous lands, and of course, mining in indigenous lands. All the threats that you can see here against those indigenous leaders and attorneys that speak and defend their land rights, you can also see it down there in Brazil. A little bit of information about international law for those that are not familiar with it. It's basically the law that is developed by states, by countries. Treaties, declarations are part of it. There are two, at least relevant for our region, two important organizations, including the United Nations, with 192 member countries, and the Organization of American States. And there are relevant norms, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was adopted in 2007, the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was adopted in 2016, and various judgments issued by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Indigenous peoples from North, Central, and South America, as you can see in the photos, they did participate in the lawmaking process of the declarations adopted by the UN and the OAS. You can see at the bottom, on the left bottom, a photo of the Haudenosaunee leaders, something that Tracy was referring at the beginning of her statement. On top, in the left, the Kuna attorney Hector Huertas presenting a statement in a General Assembly in 2016 at the OAS when the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted, and so forth. I'm showing these photos to tell you basically that all the rights that are protected by these two declarations, the UN and the OAS, were part of a consensus that was achieved through years of negotiations between representatives of member states and indigenous peoples. In the case of the OAS, of North, Central, and South America, including indigenous leaders and attorneys from Brazil. Brazil, the same as the US, were part of these negotiations, and they have endorsed the declaration. There are also relevant legal standards that come out of these declarations. The photos that you see on your left are basically the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in San Jose, Costa Rica, the judges that make those decisions, and at the bottom, photos of the Inter-American Commission in a country visit made to Brazil in 2018. In that very important country visit, the Commission received information already about the Marco Temporal, the temporal landmark thesis. And in the report that was issued this year, in 2021 by the Commission said that the temporal landmark thesis disregards the innumerable cases in which indigenous peoples were violently evicted from the territories they have traditionally occupied, and for that reason only, were not occupying them in 1988. Accordingly, the Commission considered that the thesis contravenes international and inter-American human rights norms and standards, especially the American Convention on Human Rights and the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's basically the Commission who has the competence to supervise compliance with the American Convention on Human Rights and the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, stating that under no circumstance the Marco Temporal thesis can be upheld because it will certainly compromise Brazil's international responsibility before the Commission and the court. Eventually, some cases may be brought to the Commission and the court, challenging an eventual decision upholding the Marco Temporal thesis. And if that's the case, for sure, both the Commission and the court will rule in favor of indigenous peoples upholding their rights, and there will be consequences in terms of policy and legislation that will need to be changed if something like that happens. You can read here several statements basically coming out of the different declarations on the rights of indigenous peoples, or different key decisions or judgments issued by the court that basically favor or protect or endorse the concerns that indigenous peoples and leaders and attorneys have about the Marco Temporal thesis. You have heard from Sonia Guajajara and attorney Eloy Terena about all of those concerns, and most of them have been captured already in these two declarations and in decisions already issued by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. The state must demarcate, title, and register indigenous lands. States must establish procedures for the legal recognition of indigenous people's ownership and possession of their lands. The state must obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples prior to the approval of any project or any action that will affect their lands or territories, particularly in connection with the development, use, or exploitation of mineral, water, or any other resource. Indigenous peoples who involuntarily have lost the possession of their lands and these have been transferred legitimately to third parties. Oh, I'm sorry. So you can see all of these different standards. I will leave the PowerPoint so that you can use it, and I can send you the different sources of these declarations, the decisions by the court. All of these standards can be used in advocating against the Marco Temporal thesis. Now, there are also policy standards, that is, safeguards measures that multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank Group, the Inter-American Development Bank Group, have established as policies. The World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, both of them lend money to Brazil. That is, Brazil is a borrowing country of both the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. As a result, Brazil has to comply with the policies that have both the World Bank and the APIB adopted. Some of those policies are policies that were created for the purpose of protecting indigenous peoples and the environment from harm that can be caused by bank-funded projects. APIB, COIABI, IDCEP, numerous indigenous organizations throughout the region have engaged in this policy-making process and review process for the purpose of making sure that each of the indigenous people's policy upheld the rights of indigenous peoples based on their customary law and based on applicable international law standards. Safeguard policies establish mandatory requirements that all borrowers, developing countries, or companies must comply with throughout the project cycle. Brazil is a member of both the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, and as a result, it holds some voting power. However, the voting power of Brazil in comparison to that of the United States is very low. For example, you can see in this slide that the United States holds a 30% of voting power at the APIB. That is, most of the decision made by the APIB in terms of policies that are approved or projects that are approved for funding are made with a substantial support of the United States. So if you're thinking what you can do from the US to help indigenous peoples in Brazil, start thinking about what you can do to influence the decisions that are made by the representative of the US in these financial institutions, because they do lend money to Brazil. Brazil does seek money from these banks, and Brazil has to comply with the policies. Some of these policies have safeguard measures, that is, mandatory requirements that all borrowing countries must comply with. And you can read some of these safeguard measures. I will mention just a few of them. No allotment. Basically, no borrower will have a project funded if that project entails individual titling in indigenous territories. no relocation, no borrower will be supported financially if a project entails the relocation of indigenous peoples from collectively held lands. Free, prior, and informed consent. The borrower must obtain the consent of the community if the project will have an adverse impact on the land, the natural resources, subject to the traditional ownership or under customary use or occupation of that community. If the project causes the relocation of the community from their land and natural resources subject to traditional ownership or under customary use or occupation, the borrower must obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of the community. That is, for example, if this Brazilian court issues a decision, upholds the Marco Temporal thesis, and as a result, some of the communities are evicted or relocated, if there is any funding coming from the World Bank or the IDB or the IFC to Brazil, the communities can file a complaint with these institutions because there is a harm, because there is no compliance with these policies. And as a result, remedial actions will have to be undertaken if a decision like that is issued. There is also safeguard measures that were created for the purpose of protecting indigenous peoples in isolation. Basically, no project that will force a contact with indigenous people in isolation will be financially supported by these institutions. At the same time, the borrower must create buffer zones in order to prevent contact with indigenous peoples in isolation, in order to prevent access to the territories where they inhabit, where they are located. All of these international law standards and international policy safeguard measures are the result of the involvement of indigenous peoples and their organizations in the lawmaking and in the policy review process. We have been working together alongside COIABI, APIB, IDCEP, and other organizations, seeking changes in these policies in order to make sure that they reflect the customary law of the indigenous peoples and international human rights law standards. So you were wondering, what does the Indian Law Resource Center have been doing? Well, for over 2 years, we have had the opportunity to work with COIABI and APIB from Brazil to build their capacity so that their political leaders and their attorneys know how to advocate at the international level, how to use international law, so that they are able to do it by themselves. We have traveled to Manaus and we have had webinars on issues that they are deciding, that they think is relevant for the fight that they are having in Brazil against all of the Bolsonaro regressive policies and actions. And we have also been building pressure here in DC by informing civil society, by informing Indian nations. We actually had a very important meeting at the National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, here in DC, to inform about the situation of indigenous peoples in Brazil. There's a photo there where you can see Eloy informing. We have also arranged meetings with people in Congress like Deborah Haaland, who is currently the Minister of Interior, Secretary of Interior, and others with the State Department as well, for the purpose of doing advocacy together. Apart from teaching how to do it together so that they are able to start building that experience. And I am very proud to say today that they are very capable and that they are actually doing this by themselves right now, after 2 years. There is a lot more to do. And we're currently discussing what else can be done. What we have been able to achieve so far is remarkable. And we also have been advocating before the United Nations and the Organization of American States. A series of important decisions have been made supporting indigenous peoples in Brazil because of everything that happened since Bolsonaro took power. Among other things, we have filed a complaint with the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples and the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. We have sent letters to the Secretary General of the UN and the OAS. We have held public hearings before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, informing and briefing the Commission about the threats coming out of private sector companies and different measures taken by the Bolsonaro administration. And we have doing it publicly and in front of the government representatives. And we have gained the support of almost every single international body or agency or expert that we were able to advocate with, or that we were able to meet or discuss this issue. Some of the results, you can see them there. There is a lot more. But for example, we have achieved an important decision by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights this year, adopting precautionary measures, protection measures for the indigenous Guajajara indigenous peoples and the Awa indigenous peoples in isolation that are located in the Arariboya indigenous territory in Brazil. And we have done this together. We have filed the precautionary measure request, a long brief that we drafted together with attorneys like Eloy Terena and others. And we have litigated this case for a couple of months, and we won the case. We also won in the UN. Very recently, the UN expert mechanism on the right of indigenous peoples issued an advice, a historical advice, based on a complaint that was filed by COIABI with the support of the Indian Law Resource Center. A long document drafted by the attorneys and leaders of COIABI together with the center. This advice basically tells what Brazil needs to do in terms of an emergency plan to take actions to combat COVID-19 in indigenous territories. Because you know that the situation there is devastating, is bad. We have also been gaining support from institutions, organizations here in Washington, D.C., where we got, for example, the National Congress of American Indians issuing a resolution supporting the rights of indigenous peoples in the Brazilian Amazon because of everything that was happening as a result of the fires in the Amazon. We got Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, supporting indigenous peoples in Brazil, calling Brazil to take actions to protect indigenous people from COVID-19. We got the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights listening to the arguments presented by the leaders and attorneys of the Yanomami, the Guajajara, and the Munduruku people. These are people that are protected by 3 different precautionary measure cases. And it happened very recently, and all of the arguments, both oral and in writing, were developed by themselves, and they did a terrific job. This is a result of the work that we have been able to do. They did it by themselves. They are actually doing it better than anyone else. We got also the support of the Tom Lantos Commission here, the commission at the US Congress, asking to take actions, asking Brazil to take action to protect the Munduruku people. There are a lot of tweets by members of the Human Rights Lantos Commission, such as Representative McGovern. And there is more, but I basically wanted to show you with photos, with some of the first pages of the decisions, with some of the press releases, what we have been able to do. And I'm eager to discuss with you what we can do, what more we can do to help leaders like Sonia Guajajara and help attorneys like Eloy Terena that are responding to the needs needs and aspiration of indigenous peoples in Brazil, whose rights are currently under threat. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leo, for that really informative presentation. I know that there's already some questions for you based on what you've shared, and we'll get to those after we have our next presenter. I'm happy now to present Dr. Nick Estes. He's a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. He's an assistant professor in the American Studies Department at the University of New Mexico. In 2014, Dr. Estes co-founded an indigenous resistance organization called the Red Nation. In 2017 and 18, he was the American Democracy Fellow at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University. He is also a member of the Oak Lake Writers Society, a network of indigenous writers committed to defend and advance Oseti Sakowin, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota sovereignty, cultures, and histories. I'm just going to remind everyone in the virtual audience that you can please add your questions to the Q&A. Os ouvintes podem já fazer suas perguntas, por favor. And after Dr. Estes' comments, we will open for comments and discussion. Thanks, Nick.
Amataki api napi chuzapi chante washte. I just want to greet you in my Lakota language with an open heart and a handshake to everyone who presented tonight, my colleagues and relatives. I also want to thank Sonia Guajajara and APIB for inviting me to Brazil. I'm calling from Brasilia right now. And I want to start with a story of something I experienced back home and how it connects to the struggle that is going on here in Brazil and in the Amazon. Last week, the right-wing party of South Dakota, which is in my homelands, hosted a large gathering, as they do, of bikers and tourists in flouting the precautions of COVID-19 as tribes, shut down the reservations to protect their own. Around 750,000 people from the outside came into our ancestral territories near sacred sites, disrupting ceremony, and also threatening not only our livelihoods, but their own livelihoods in fighting the tribes in their efforts to combat COVID-19. The state of South Dakota has actually threatened the governor of Kristi Noem, who is to the right of Trump politically, has threatened the tribes in the past to deploy the National Guard to take down our health checkpoints to protect our own people. So last week, there was also another meeting that was concurrent to the bike rally and the governor's kind of show of force of inviting these outsiders. And it was led by a man named Mike Lindell, who is one of the main conspiracy theorists of Trump losing the election last year. And one of the guests that was invited and hosted by the state of South Dakota was Eduardo Bolsonaro, who is the son of Jair Bolsonaro. And while he was speaking, he called Lula da Silva a criminal and, quote, the most dangerous leftist in the world. And why I bring this up is because the state of South Dakota is relatively isolated geographically. It doesn't have a large population, but nonetheless, it is connecting itself with a global network of right-wing authoritarian movements, specifically seeing itself in the image of Jair Bolsonaro's government. And I want to read you another quote from 1998 from the current president, Jair Bolsonaro, where he said, quote, "It's a shame that the Brazilian cavalry wasn't as efficient as the Americans who exterminated their Indians," end quote. And so what these two members of the same family say to me is that the Indian policy in the United States, the policy of genocide, to remove indigenous people from the land, to exterminate them, to take the land, to make way for capitalist development, is being extended into a place like Brazil. And Brazil, the current government is trying to model its efficacy and policies based on the United States efficacy and policies of extermination. And this is an incredibly important, I think, moment in history, because although we did defeat Trump in the United States, and he fast-tracked many policies of privatization, of opening public lands for development, specifically targeting indigenous territories, we are still continuing the fight to roll back the policies that he set in motion. And I'll get to that in a bit. But I want to talk a little bit about why I'm here in Brazil. We came at the invitation, the Progressive International, of which I'm a council member, came at the invitation of APIB leaders such as Sonia Guajajara, as well as Sandra Munduruku, to meet with tribal authorities and to discuss what I think the other panelists have laid out very clearly, the issue, the land grab issue, as well as the genocidal policy of this current government. And to meet with officials and to meet with the communities and to understand the situation in the best way that we can support, specifically in the United States. And I want to talk about a little bit about the lessons of solidarity that we learned in recent uprisings in the United States and connect them to the current struggle for life, land, and water here in Brazil and the Amazon. So as Leonardo just pointed out, there was a massive movement to stop the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota, in Oceti-Sakowin territory, and territory where I am from, using legal mechanisms of treaty law, as well as ancestral and customary law to resist a pipeline. And it's important to point out that this struggle happened under the Obama administration, and we were somewhat successful at stopping it for a brief moment in time, or at least challenging it legally, but it was later fast-tracked under Trump. And what this movement taught us is that we are not in this struggle alone. This struggle brought together over 400 different indigenous nations within the United States, as well as outside of the United States. We had representatives coming from the Amazon. We had representatives from the Sami people coming from Europe. So it was a global movement. But one of the things that I noticed in talking about the history of this particular land and defending our river, Minnesota, or the Missouri River, which is one of the longest rivers in the world, it goes all the way into the Gulf of Mexico, is that also at this historic location was the founding of an important international indigenous movement. And some of the, Tracy and Leonardo mentioned this, but back in 1974, there was a gathering, a very humble gathering on the banks of the Missouri River near Standing Rock, which brought together about 5,000 representatives from 98 different nations. Many of them were indigenous people from North America as well as South America. And they formed what is called the International Indian Treaty Council. And one of the primary documents that they used to form the International Indian Treaty Council was the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. And what happened was that the indigenous movement in the United States, specifically the American Indian movement, had led an armed resistance movement against the United States government based on legal claims to land, and had got caught up in the court system. The leaders had been relatively neutralized, but the elders pushed to advocate to take the claims of the treaty to a world court, a world forum, and allying with organizations such as the Indian Law Center, as well as the World Council on Indigenous Peoples and others. They held that historic meeting in Geneva in 1977 to articulate the rights of indigenous people. So it's important to remember that the frameworks that were laid out didn't come because of the goodwill, the good graces of the United Nations or the North Atlantic powers in Europe. They came through struggle. A lot of people were killed. Some were imprisoned. Some of them are still imprisoned, just so that we could be here today talking about these rights and understanding their effectiveness and relevance to our current situation. Fast forward to today, the Dakota Access Pipeline was built under the Trump administration and continues to pump oil across the Missouri River, threatening our water supply. But there's also the construction of another pipeline, the tar sands pipeline, that is seen as a plan B, so to speak, of the Keystone XL pipeline, which the Biden administration canceled because of mass mobilizations, primarily from Indigenous people and the Ocheti Shakowing. But the Line 3 pipeline is wants to pump tar sands oil from the Alberta tar sands area, which has created a dead zone the size of the state of Florida, to pump this oil across Anishinaabe and Dakota lands in northern Minnesota. And it's important to remember the historic victory that we had in defeating Trump and getting him out of office, and hopefully building an alternative to the destructive, project that he had implemented. But under the Biden administration, we're still facing a lot of foot dragging on getting things done. Biden's domestic policy advisor, Susan Rice, had $2.3 million invested in Enbridge, which is the pipeline company building Line 3. And because of an ethics investigation, she was asked to divest her money from that pipeline project. But nonetheless, the Biden administration has been advocating through the courts against the tribes and environmental groups for this particular pipeline. And the White Earth Reservation has brought a suit against that pipeline company. And the plaintiff is not a human, but it's wild rice. Because wild rice is a traditional food that has been harvested since time immemorial by the Anishinaabe and Dakota people. And it's being threatened not only by the pipeline, but by global climate change. And so when we talk about the recent discovery of mass graves in Canada of Indigenous children, I think the number is several thousand. But the headlines, there were headlines made when they discovered just several hundred bodies of these children who were taken to these boarding schools and where they died. In the United States, we had twice as many boarding schools. And it's expected that the deaths will be far greater than what has been accounted for and discovered. But because of the investigation and the advocacy of somebody like Deb Haaland, we are undergoing a federal investigation of the boarding schools and their impact on Indigenous communities. And Deb Haaland, has played a key role, as Leonardo had pointed out, in connecting the struggles of Indigenous people in the United States to those in Brazil. And I had the fortune of meeting Joanna Wapichana, whose office is in the Congress, whose office is office number 231, which is also the article of the Constitution of Brazil that protects Indigenous rights. And in her office, she has a picture of Deb Haaland to show that historic connection. And just because Deb Haaland is no longer an elected representative doesn't mean that project has ended, but it continues through the work that we're doing. And I want to say just a few more things about how we in the United States can think about our role in protecting and advancing the project that all of my colleagues have talked about, that my hosts here in Brazil have talked about and advocated for. The IPCC just came out with a report, a very devastating, a very grim report about the future of this planet if we don't act fast. But I want to add a corrective to some of the news articles that have been coming out. They blame, quote unquote, human activity for the cause of climate change, as if every human on this planet is equally responsible. And we know that this is not the case. We know that this is a systemic issue, that specifically capitalist development and the fossil fuel economy itself is leading to global climate changes. And 27 oil companies are responsible for 30% of global emissions. We can name these companies, we can name these people, these billionaires who are responsible for polluting the planet and making it unlivable. And we can also look at, another piece of devastating news came out in tandem with the IPCC report, which said that the Amazon rainforest was no longer a carbon sink, but a net emitter of carbon because of the fires, because of the development, because of the clear cutting, because of the evictions from land and the assassination of indigenous leaders, the criminalization of indigenous resistance, the criminalization of the resistance from Afro-descended people in Brazil, as well as the quilombos. And now we see this as another land grab with, with the Supreme Court case that's coming up, as well as the legislation that has been proposed. And so where does that leave us, as indigenous people in the Americas, not just in North America, but throughout the hemisphere, as well as people throughout the world? I was speaking with a man named Danildo Rodriguez, who is from CONAC, which represents the Quilomboas movement here in Brazil. And he said to me, when the Amazon burns, we burn, and the world burns. So we can say when the wild rice paddies in northern Minnesota burn, the world burns as well. And we can say that the lungs of the world are on fire right now. All of our lungs are on fire right now. But we must refuse to be burned. And we must take inspiration from the heroic resistance and the heroic creation of indigenous leadership in Brazil in resisting this legislation, and to say that we refuse to be burned and that we can't fight fire with more fire, but we have to fight fire with water and a project for life. And as we say in Lakota territory, Mini Wichoni, water is life. And I want to leave us with that. I have more to say, but I believe my colleagues before me said it best. And I just want to give, my utmost sincere gratitude for everyone for hosting us, but to take this issue serious and to support the lawsuits that are charging the Bolsonaro government with genocide. It not only benefits the people here, but it'll set a precedent, not only for Brazil, but for the rest of the world, that the killing of indigenous people is the killing of this planet.
Thank you, Nick, for your comments. We have some time now for some questions from our audience. A gente tem tempo agora para perguntas do público. I'd request that if you have questions for the panelists, that you please put them in the Q&A, if you could, so that it's easier to see which questions have been addressed and which ones haven't. You can make your questions in English or in Portuguese. Pode fazer perguntas em inglês ou português. Our translators can help with that. And several people have questions that are specific to the events going on in Brasilia. I would ask that if you have a follow-up, please put your contact information in the chat. We can save it and then pass your contact information to the relevant parties afterwards, so that your questions can be addressed. Se tivesse uma pergunta muito específica, por favor, deixe seu contato no chat, tá? Para a gente entrar em contato depois. I'm going to try to go by the order of questions in which they were received. So we have our first question goes to Leo. I have to let you know that Sonia Guajajara is already on her way to Brasilia. She's organizing the event that was mentioned several times in this evening's presentation. So unfortunately, she's not here to answer questions. Eloy it also represents APIB, and hopefully he'll be able to answer the questions with regard to APIB. But the first question again will go to Leo. So Leo, the question is, the impacts of development projects funded by the IMF and the World Bank in indigenous and traditional populations in Brazil are recognized. Are there cases that you could tell us about in which institutions like the World Bank and the IMF have been successful in exerting pressure on national governments in protecting indigenous lands?
Good question. Yes, very briefly, just I want to mention two examples. There are more, but definitely you need to know that each of these financial institutions, the World Bank, the IFC, the Inter-American Development Bank, have a project complaint mechanism or accountability mechanism. It is also the way it is called. That mechanism was created for the purpose of receiving complaints filed by local people because of two reasons. One, there is no compliance with existing environmental and social safeguard policies, such as the policy on indigenous peoples and others, or there is actual harm to the local people and or the environment. So for example, in 1995, 24 NGOs from Brazil filed a complaint with the World Bank inspection panel. That's the World Bank's accountability mechanism, challenging the land administration and natural resources administration of Rondônia, a project funded to Brazil. Brazil was a borrowing country in that case. The goal of that project was to protect biodiversity, conservation areas, and indigenous territories. However, the complaint that was filed by the NGOs raised concerns about adverse impacts actually on the rural and indigenous communities located in Rondônia within the project area. So the complaint was filed. The inspection panel declared the complaint eligible for an investigation and carried out an investigation. And by the end of 1995, the panel concluded the investigation and adopted a report with recommendations upholding the concerns raised by the complainants. In particular, the inspection panel stated that there was a defective or no indigenous peoples plan. Basically, the indigenous peoples policy of the World Bank asked borrowing countries to develop a plan that will not only lay out the basis for consultations with indigenous peoples when there are projects, activities that will potentially harm them, but also benefit sharing agreements that could be made with the communities, so that the project not only achieves the project goals that was stated in the project itself, but also benefit the communities located in the area, especially indigenous communities. So the inspection panel detected that there was no indigenous peoples plan. So that was basically no compliance with indigenous peoples policy. And it also noted that that FUNAI was falling short in demarcating 5 indigenous lands located throughout the McKenzie River. The FUNAI was also failing to resolve land conflicts affecting the land tenure of the Uru'e-Wawau people. And there was also a lack of measures oriented to protect or to protect the health of the communities that were potentially impacted by the project. And all of that was basically an actual harm to the communities. So as a result, the inspection panel asked Brazil a series of recommendations that must be made, otherwise the funding would stop. And that's actually what happened after this complaint. That's a clear example against Brazil by the World Bank inspection panel. Now, I can talk to you about another example by the Inter-American Development Bank, this time against a private sector project. It is called the Mareñas Renovables Wind Power Project, a very recent project funded by the Inter-American Development Bank partially. And there was also a pool of private sector investors and companies, including Walmart, Mitsubishi, Heineken, and others. They wanted to build a wind farm in collectively held land that was basically held by one community, but was also a sacred site for other 7 communities located in the isthmus of Tehuantepec in Oaxaca, Mexico. In that case, I represented the communities potentially affected by this project because the project company, the Mourinhos company, failed basically to consult properly with the communities concerned about the potential impact of the project, to the point that project documents that were of mandatory release were not actually shared with the communities. And as a result, the communities have no means to know about the project in order to engage in a meaningful consultation. This conclusion was made by the Inter-American Development Bank's project complaint mechanism, which is called Independent Consultation and Investigation Mechanism, MISI in Spanish. So I filed the complaint on their behalf, and together we filed the additional information. MISI carried out the investigation and concluded that way that there was no compliance with the indigenous peoples policy and the access to information policy, and also potential harm to not only the community that held the communal land where the wind farm was going to be built, but also by the other 6 communities that are culturally connected to that communal land for ceremonial purposes, and also because the transmissions lines were going to be built in each of these communities, and they were not identified as potential adverse impact against them. So these are 2 results, clearly exerted pressure on the governments and the companies, because indigenous peoples were able to file complaints using the mechanism that exists in these institutions, and advocating in light of the safeguard measures that indigenous peoples themselves were able to fight for by engaging in the review of the environmental and social safeguard policies of these institutions.
Thank you, Leo. I have 2 questions. The first for Eloy, and then a second for Nick. I'm going to ask Eloy the question first and then put the question to Nick. Se os norte-americanos decidiram fazer grandes campanhas de boicote com o objetivo de atingir o agronegócio no Brasil, qual seria o mais importante?
Bom, falhou o áudio, mas é essa pergunta que está aqui, né, no chat.
Está conseguindo ver a pergunta da Miriam?
Sim, sim. Tem projeto legislativo de trâmite no Congresso Nacional.
Não é esse não, desculpe, está na outra janela. A pergunta é se os norte-americanos decidiram fazer grandes campanhas de boicote com o objetivo de atingir o agronegócio no Brasil, qual seria o mais importante?
Da questão da dimensão do agronegócio, será? Assim, um dos impactos, né, que a gente vê muito é a questão do gado, né, que avança sobre os territórios indígenas, e isso não é só uma realidade da Amazônia, do Mato Grosso do Sul ou do Centro-Oeste brasileiro, mas também tem crescido muito na Amazônia, né? Nesse sentido, tem uma experiência muito importante que nós fizemos, salvo engano, foi 2019, em parceria com a Amazon Watch, em que nós fomos a Nova York participar de uma reunião dos acionistas da BlackRock, né, que é um grande fundo de investimento que aplica recursos, por exemplo, na JBS, né, que é um dos maiores frigoríficos do país e que compra gado, né, que são aí produzidos em terras indígenas ou em terras que têm conflitos com comunidades indígenas. Então, esse é talvez um aspecto importante que a gente tem chamado a atenção, além de cobrar, né, do governo brasileiro, chamar também a responsabilização para as empresas, para os grandes fundos financeiros, né, que devem observar os direitos humanos, os direitos indígenas, que foi isso que o Léo já trouxe aqui, e também a sociedade civil, né, tem que ter consciência, e isso é um aspecto que a gente tem chamado muita atenção no mercado que nós chamamos de mercado do norte, né? Então, é preciso criar mecanismos internos, sim, para saber da onde está vindo, né, a matéria-prima, e aí, especialmente, a questão da carne, né, que é comercializada fora do Brasil, e que esse produto, ele está sendo produzido em cima de território indígena e, em muitos casos, custando a vida de povos indígenas, de crianças indígenas. Então, não é exagero quando nós falamos isso, isso é uma realidade constante no Brasil. Algumas lideranças Guarani Kaiowá chegam até a falar, né, que um gado, né, um boi, vale mais do que uma vida indígena no Brasil, porque a valorização, né, disso em detrimento da vida indígena fica flagrantemente demonstrado quando não se adota políticas de proteção e demarcação dos territórios indígenas e, por outro lado, há todo um alinhamento do governo com os setores do agronegócio. Então, nós achamos que isso seria uma coisa importante, que a gente tem chamado a atenção também para a responsabilização de todos os setores que também estão envolvidos, né, nessa corrente aí do comércio.
Thanks, Eloy. Muito obrigada. The next question is going to be for Nick from Mauricio Bupo. He says, I'm a Brazilian in Canada. I'm sending my full support as Indigenous peoples here suffered greatly with residential schools. Could you please talk a bit about the residential schools in the United States? Pipelines are a big issue in Canada, and there's a strong movement against them in Quebec and British Columbia, especially. He's from an organization called the Struggle Committee.
Sure. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada that ran from, I believe, 2008 to 2015, identified 139 federally run or federally supported boarding schools or residential schools in Canada. In the United States, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition identified, I think, 367 boarding schools, so more than 2 times that in Canada. And so I don't know, like the extent to which, if the numbers, you know, the amount of students who went, but nonetheless, it creates more sites to be investigated and just, you know, and to look at. And one of the primary sites that I think is incredibly important is the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, which it's at the site of one of the oldest military bases in the United States. It's actually a current active military base. To get onto the site to visit the boarding school, you have to go through a security screening. It's the Army War College now, and there were at least 200 identified graves of Indigenous children who went there. There's suspected that there's many more. There are actually tribes who are working on returning some of those children. But it's important to remember the context in which Carlisle was created. It was created by a military man named Captain Pratt, who coined the phrase, "Kill the Indian, save the man," which was essentially to deracinate, to uproot, to violently uproot and steal away children as part of this child removal process to terrorize Native families. It was a tactic of the U.S. military on the battlefield. Actually, Custer was famous for riding into, he was a commander of the cavalry. Custer was famous for riding into a camp of mostly non-combatants and capturing the women, the children, and the elders to force the surrender of the tribe. And so what Pratt had seen was a way to, and this is the language that they used, to take hostage the children, to force the secession of land, or the cession of land, the giving over of land, but also to, quote unquote, ensure the good behavior of the children, ensure the good behavior of the parents, so that they would be more pliant and compliant to the United States. And at this period in time, at the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century, this is when you see massive land grabs. Like, we're talking 270 million acres of territory, the size of the state of Montana, that was handed over because these parents and these leaders were coerced into handing it over. But Indian child removal didn't end after the boarding school era. It actually continued well on into the 20th century and continues well on into the 21st century. In 1978, when the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed, 1 out of every 3 Native children in the United States had been adopted out to a white foster care system or a white family. So 1 out of 3. This is a generational experience. If you look at the current attacks on tribal lands, it's not just attacking our land rights themselves, but it's also attacking our child welfare system. The Gibson Dunn, which is a corporate law firm that defended the likes of Amazon, Chevron, Walmart, is now defending as the lawyer for these plaintiffs who are trying to take apart the Indian Child Welfare Act and have been successful. But it's not just for the quote unquote welfare of the children. They are actually aiming to dismantle the entire structure of Indian law that's protecting indigenous lands. And they see this as a backdoor. And they're hoping to push this case into the Supreme Court, to get the Supreme Court, which is populated by right-wing judges, to rule against tribal sovereignty and to say that we are a quote unquote race-based federal institution or federal entity and not political entities, right? And our argument against that would be, well, you don't make treaties, with a minority population. You make treaties with nations. So you'd have to, adjudicate on all these treaties that have been made. But nonetheless, it's a very the legacy of Indian boarding schools, the legacy of Indian child removal is still an issue today, and it centers on land.
Thank you, Nick. So we're almost out of time, but there's another important question in the chat, if our panelists wouldn't mind answering. I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to make a brief closing statement that has something to do with this question, if you wouldn't mind in your own way. The question is thanking you for your presentations, and it's asking basically about the relationships between North and South, between Indigenous peoples in the North and in the South, and if you can offer any guidance to people who would like to facilitate these kinds of communications and interactions going forward with regard to your own networks, institutions, and the work that you do. So we can just go in the order of your presentations, if you don't mind, Leo, and then Eloy, and then Nick. And these will be your closing statements, and then we'll thank you and let everybody can go on with their evening. Leo.
Okay, North and South relationship. I guess I am from Argentina, and I'm working in the United States at the Indian Law Resource Center, which is the office, one of the offices based in DC. From that office, I'm able to work with Native American attorneys and Native American leaders and chiefs, with Indigenous leaders from Mexico, Central and South America. And I have seen how fruitful is when we work together. And I can mention a lot of examples, starting with the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples adopted by the UN in 2007, the American Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples adopted by the Organization of American States in 2016. In the last 2 years, I was able to work, we were able to work very closely with attorneys like Eloy Terena, with leaders like Sonia Bone Guajajara from Brazil, and we were able to build a very strong advocacy strategy, and we were able to pursue our goals successfully together. That means it is possible if we are willing to make the effort to work together. I don't speak Portuguese, and I am able to work with Eloy and others who either don't speak Spanish or English. That is, the language barrier are not able to stop us if we are willing to work together, if we have the necessary resources to do so. So I would encourage to support as much as you can every interaction, relationship, partnership between indigenous peoples and organizations from North America, Central and South America.
Tá ótimo, obrigada. Eloy, a Simone já fez a pergunta em português?
Sim.
Ok.
Não, eu também gostaria muito de agradecer a oportunidade. Eu acho que este webinário foi mais assim, uma oportunidade de demonstrar a capacidade, né, do movimento indígena de fazer articulação e também, cada vez mais, a necessidade de fazer essas articulações de norte a sul e sul a norte, né? Não tem que ser só de cima para baixo, mas é de baixo também para cima, a gente buscando aí, elegendo as questões que nos afetam, né, essas estruturas que são estruturas políticas, econômicas, e são mundiais, né? Então, as lideranças indígenas que estão nos territórios conseguem enxergar essa dimensão, e cabe a nós aqui fazer essas pontes, né? O exemplo que o Leo trouxe é fundamental. A gente tem buscado eliminar essa barreira linguística, né? Mas, mesmo assim, não temos desistido de trabalhar juntos. Há 4 anos atrás, quando o Leo esteve na Assembleia da COIAB, né? E nós tivemos a oportunidade de conhecê-lo, e desde então nós começamos a trabalhar em casos na Comissão Interamericana, algumas incidências na ONU, e estamos aumentando cada vez mais, né, as formas de atuação. Isso é fundamental, porque a gente une, além da estratégia e do saber tradicional, esses outros instrumentos, né, que nós cada vez mais estamos se apropriando. Então, eu vejo isso como muito possível, e nós contamos cada vez mais com parceiros que estão dispostos a eliminar essas barreiras, a construir pontes, né, e que estejam abertos também ao diálogo. Isso é uma coisa que os povos indígenas têm feito, e feito muito, com muita incidência. Quero agradecer a todos que nos acompanharam, né, nesta noite, do Brasil e fora do Brasil. Estamos organizando, né, o acampamento Terra Livre, o acampamento Luta pela Vida, e na semana que vem nós estaremos já fazendo as nossas agendas também aqui em Brasília, pedindo aí aos nossos ancestrais para que nos dê força, né, para enfrentar este governo, que é um governo muito truculento, um governo extremamente reacionário e contrário aos nossos direitos, mas desde o primeiro dia que Bolsonaro assumiu, em nenhum momento nós paramos. Pelo contrário, nós somos os primeiros a se levantar, naquele momento em que pairava sobre o Brasil muitas dúvidas e muito medo, os povos indígenas se levantaram e fizeram o enfrentamento necessário. E é isso que nós continuamos fazendo, mesmo no contexto da pandemia. Então, agradeço a todos pelo apoio e peço que também nos ajude, junte-se a nós nessa luta, que é uma luta pela vida, pela defesa da vida.
Muito obrigada, Eloy. Nós que agradecemos a sua presença aqui, estamos com vocês, com todos vocês nessa luta na semana que vem. Nick, I'm going to give you the final comments, and then I'm going to pass it on to Natalia with my thanks.
I started my presentation with talking about the connections between Bolsonaro and the right-wing movement in the United States. It's not just a good thing to connect with the South, right? It's a necessity. It's a necessity for survival, because Bolsonaro was not possible without Trump, right? And they are seeing the importance of making those connections from the South into the North. And we must also see those important connections, not in a cynical antagonism to them, but because their project is based on destruction and ours is based on life. And I would just recommend that we continue to have these dialogues, but also try to find points of unity amongst our various nations, and going beyond just indigenous communities as well, and finding the strength within our own nations and the organizations and the movements that we can ally with, that articulate the same vision, that share that same struggle. Now is the time to build. Now is the time to reconstruct. It's not a time of cynicism. It's not a time of pessimism. It's a time of optimism, of the spirit. As you know, Sonia said at the beginning of it, the future is ancestral, and we have, you know, only to gain our rightful place as indigenous people back on the lands that we call home. And that means, you know, coexistence, a peaceful coexistence with the people who arrived here. And we have the solution for that. You know, our project is that of life. It is not that of destruction.
Could not imagine more important words to share at this moment. Let me reiterate my warm thanks to Leonardo Crippa, to Eloy Terena, to Nick Estes, and of course to Sonia Guajajara for your time and for sharing all of these important issues and ideas with us. I invite the audience to keep in touch with the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. We have all of the social media that is possible, and you can find us quite easily. So thank you again to everybody and to the audience. I'm going to pass the mic now to Natalia de Campos, who's going to close our event this evening.
Obrigada, Tracy. Thank you, Tracy. And thank you, Nick Estes, Eloy Terena, and Leonardo Crippa, as well as Sonia Guajajara, who had to step out a little earlier for her flight to Brasilia. So we are really happy that you were here. We are in solidarity with you, with the campaign Struggle for Life, Luta pela Vida. I'd like to remind everybody that this was organized by the Indigenous Rights Working Group of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil, along with partners such as Amazon Watch, APIB, Smoke Signal Monitor, the University of Miami, Grassroots International, Coletivo por Brasil Democrático, the Defend Democracy in Brazil Committee. And also we want to thank our media partners, APIB, Media India, Media Ninja, Amazon Watch, and FIBRA, the Frente Internacional de Brasileiros contra o Golpe, who are also broadcasting and sharing on social media. All the social media from these groups, you can watch back this discussion. And also we would like to say that, you know, the network is in growing, this is the first event of this working group, but the network has done several events with Eloy already, with Sonia Guajajara, and we hope to enlarge the solidarity with the indigenous groups here. We are activists, academics, union leaders, community activists, community organizers. So we're very much in solidarity with you. That said, APIB also released the dossier that Eloy mentioned, and we are going to link the QR code in the last page of the event, so you can donate to the Struggle for Life encampment in Brasilia that is happening this coming week. If you want to donate, if you want to get more information, you can go to apiboficial.org. It's linking in the chat as well. And you can also visit all our social medias to find out more. Thank you again, everyone. And have a good evening.